Is this what we're gonna do? Hey everybody, Red May surges onward here. Tonight, what was liberalism? But before we get onto our panel, I'd like to cue you in to what else we've got going over the next few days. On Saturday at noon, bottlenecks, choke points, and supply chains with Lale Khalili, Deborah Cowan, Charmaine Chua, Sandro Mazadra, and Spencer Cox as the moderator. At 6 p.m. on Saturday, the political economy of COVID-19, Radhika Desai will give her analysis as to what's liable to happen afterwards and what is happening now economically. There will be a few responses. On Sunday at noon, Sunday at 1 p.m., Socialism After Sanders and Shelter in Place with Olivia Catby-Smith, Nick Mitchell, Jeremy Gilbert, Hannah Atkinson should be great. And on Sunday evening, 6 p.m., Sarah Jaffe and Michelle Chen will be back with Belabored, labor journalists. They'll be talking to Cal Winslow, who has a new book on the Seattle General Strike of 1919. And on Monday night, Communism or Neo-Feudalism, Jody Dean's rendition of Updating of Socialism or Barbarism. So that's at 1 p.m. I'm sorry, it's not in the night. So check that one out. And then finally, Friday evening at 5 p.m. after geoengineering, Dan Denver of The Dig, Jacobins of The Dig, interviews Holly Jean Buck about her new book. So before we get started, I want to make a pitch for money. You know, our 1 month vacation from capitalism is unfortunately not free because we're in capitalism. So in order to keep this madness going, we need the kindness of strangers. So please go to our website, www.redmayseattle.org, or down to YouTube, our YouTube Red May TV section, and click on the donate buttons at each place and give what you can. And also subscribe to our Red May TV station because we need more subscribers. So anyway, I will now turn our evening over to Michael Bray, who is a professor at Southwestern University and is the author of Powers of Mind, Mental and Manual Labor in the Contemporary Political Crisis, which is an excellent book. We're hoping it comes down in price in about a year. And he is also the author of five theses on the, what's the exact title?
The title is The Virus Infects Politics. And it's actually 6. I should have said before, 6 theses on, I forget the title.
Well, there are 6 theses on the pandemic in the new Spectre Journal, a new radical journal put out by a plethora of very smart radicals like Charlie Post and Kate Dell Griffiths and Zachary Levinson. So do check out Spectre. But Michael, take it away.
Thanks, Philip. I thought I'd just start briefly by just actually expressing thanks and gratitude to you and to the other folks who have helped in putting Red May together, because I don't know if folks realize, probably a lot of them do, that you all have in effect put together and organized 2 different month-long schedules of events for this May. I was very much looking forward to being in Seattle. This weekend was actually when I was supposed to be there. And I'm sorry that didn't happen, but the kind of effort you all have put in to this is just phenomenal. And what you've managed to put together in this online edition in just 2 weeks is really impressive. And so thank you to you and to everybody else involved for doing this. All right, so, and this is one of those phenomenal panels that you have put together. And so I'll just introduce each speaker as before each of them speaks. And so the first speaker is going to be Alexander Zevin. He is an assistant professor of history at City University of New York and an editor at the New Left Review. Alexander?
Great. I'm really excited to be here and to be on this panel with all of you. and to talk about what was liberalism and what it is. I thought I'd start by talking a little bit about my book, and then proceed to talk about maybe more interesting things to do with sort of historical precedents around the sort of perceived crises of liberalism and how liberalism has kind of withstood and flourished in the aftermath of those crises, and then bring us up to the present to kind of ask where liberalism will stand at the end of this present crisis with the pandemic. So, first of all, my book, Liberalism at Large: The World According to the Economist. In my book, I try to do something a little bit different with the study of liberalism. First of all, I try to ground it historically. So, liberalism is a much abused term. And maybe it's in second place now to neoliberalism in terms of the ways in which it is used and abused. But what I wanted to do was to sort of resist or push back against definitions that start either in the 17th century with John Locke as the kind of proto-liberal who argues, in so many words, for life, liberty, and property, and that this is the kind of foundation of liberalism. And I also wanted to push back against histories that begin in the 18th century with Adam Smith as the original kind of liberal political economist. In my argument, in my telling, liberalism emerges at a specific moment in Europe in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, first in Spain and then in France, and it largely has a political meaning, an attempt to limit the powers of the absolute monarchies, while also resisting popular pressure from below. And so this will manifest itself in some kind of suffrage, some kind of responsible government, but also freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, and so forth. The term then migrates to Britain, and in Britain, I argue there is a unique synthesis that political ideas of liberalism that emerge on the continent of Europe merge with economic maxims of free trade and the absolute right to private property in theories of limited government. And what I try to do in this different telling of liberalism is also I use a different source. I use the Economist magazine, which is founded in 1843. And I argue gives us a kind of unique way of looking at, of understanding liberalism that doesn't focus on one thinker or one theme in the history of that vast subject, but actually allows us to understand liberalism as an evolving set of questions, of confrontations, and of developments. And so the sort of structuring themes of my book are really move us away from an understanding of liberalism as sort of focused on individual liberty or freedom, whether that's in a kind of, positive or negative sense, to reference Isaiah Berlin's famous formulation of that problem, and to these confrontations. And there are three. So the first is, what did liberals have to say after the 1840s about demands for democracy? Because if liberals in the 1810s, 20s, and 30s demand responsible government, that leaves open the question, responsible to whom, right? And liberals in the 19th century and into the 20th century adamantly resist, or at least liberals in my story adamantly resist the idea of one man, one vote, let alone one woman, one vote. And in the 20th century, devise ways to cope with and to limit the impact of universal suffrage when it arrives. And so in this sense, my story of liberalism is not sort of a teleological one in which liberals gradually and wisely welcome universal suffrage, but in which they resist and negotiate and sometimes outright seek to end sort of democratic forms. The second theme is the rise of empire. What do liberals have to say about the expansion of European nation states outside of the sort of geographically defined area of the state abroad. And in the earlier period of liberals are arguing that that empire is one of the more pernicious forms of protection. Of course, this is an argument that Adam Smith makes famous. But again, by the 1850s, in my story, liberals, especially those who are in and around the journal, The Economist, are arguing that empire can be an absolute necessity when it comes to actually stitching together a free trade world, that far from the Cobdenite idea of peace, free trade, and goodwill, free trade can actually require the use of force. And I document the way that unfolds in the Crimean War in 1854, the suppression of the Indian Mutiny in 1857, and then the Opium Wars in China as kind of classic examples of the ways in which people are forced to trade freely, if you will. So that's the second theme. The third theme is the expansion, the rise of, the ascendancy of finance within the global capitalist order and within British political economy in particular. So if the classical political economists regarded, were worried about land, labor, and production, the profits, the question of what it was that finance was doing, especially finance that was being sent abroad in ever greater quantities. Britain historically sent by far the largest amount of foreign capital abroad of any nation state in history as percentage of its GDP. What did liberals have to say about that, and how, in particular, and I think The Economist focuses our attention on this, how did they create a kind of politics that was suitable to a world in which the absolute freedom of capital, the absolute mobility of capital was a priority? So today we think of Standard & Poor's and Moody's and these other credit rating agencies. We routinely hear about what Argentina is going to do to restructure its debts, or how Italy needs to par back its ambitious social spending programs. But that is a kind of worldview that originates with The Economist, and that is something new in the world at the time that The Economist is founded. So those are the three themes of the book, and those are the ways I try to upset the apple cart when it comes to talking about what liberalism has meant and means. So I'll just quickly say I have no idea how long I've been talking. Hopefully not too long, but it's hard, when you're in your study. But I'll just say briefly that one of the reasons that I'm skeptical that we've transcended liberalism, or the variant of liberalism known as neoliberalism, or at least that's how I view it, has to do with some of the crises that my book deals with, some of the ways in which liberals have dealt with and responded to previous crises. So I thought I'd just mention two, and obviously historical analogies, this is very fraught, and I'm sometimes very critical of other historians who, mobilize what I consider to be historically inapt analogies, but these are more examples than sort of analogies. So first of all, one of the founding crises that my book, or rather plagues that my book documents, is the Irish famine in the late 1840s. And The Economist and its editor, James Wilson, is absolutely instrumental in guiding the policy of the British government. By that point, he is an important secretary to the Treasury. He's elected to Parliament in 1846. And he's exchanging secret minutes with the Secretary of State for Ireland, as well as cabinet ministers and other important officials at the Treasury. And The Economist itself is attempting to guide public opinion in terms of attitudes towards what should be done in Ireland. And the paper in its original form is probably the purest expression we have of laissez-faire, and the idea that the market should be left alone to determine the optimal outcomes. And The Economist takes this absolutely as far as it can go. And for them, there should be no forgiveness of debt. There should be no outdoor relief. There should be no purchase of grain in the New World, or stocking of grain within Ireland, no restrictions on the export of butter, of grain, because of course during the famine those things are being exported out of Ireland. So this is and you know, we don't have to just remain in Ireland. We can think of Mike Davis's story about the Great Famine in India in the 1870s as well. That these are two kind of classical cases, if you like, of laissez-faire ideology guiding imperial policy. And far from these crises, which resulted in millions of dead, far from undermining the ideological hegemony of liberalism, they were indeed moments that embedded liberalism and the liberal state for the long term. And that took different forms in Ireland and India. Okay, so that's sort of one example. I could say a lot more about it. I'm kind of broad strokes. But the other that I wanted to think about just very briefly was the period in the post-war Britain. This is another sort of period that my book deals with. And it stages basically the arguments between the Economist as the kind of representative of liberal economic orthodoxy and John Maynard Keynes. As Keynes works his way, basically moving away from the position that he himself had grown up in as a student with the editor of The Economist at the time, a guy named Walter Lippmann. They had been students of Alfred Marshall, a very important, very influential English political economist. And he, you know, by the mid-1920s, Keynes has begun to really profoundly question whether or not these liberal economic orthodoxies to do with the gold standard, to do with austerity and balanced budgets, as well as many other things, can help explain, let alone mitigate, the crisis that Britain finds itself in. Because after the First World War, again, this is a moment when people are starting to say liberalism has run its course. Clearly, the role of the state in allocating resources in the First World War implies the end of laissez-faire orthodoxies, right? But actually, in the period after the First World War, we see a quick snap back. In other words, the liberal state, of which Britain is perhaps the kind of locus classicus, is able to deal with an immense amount of state involvement in the economy, rationing of credit, rationing of food, the actual control of factory production in the new Ministry of Munitions. Famously, Lloyd George heads that ministry. And yet, at the end of the war, harsh austerity is reimposed, the gold standard is reimposed, all of these things that seem rationally to have been superseded are reimposed. And so the arguments that Keynes and The Economist have go on for another decade. And the reason that Keynes, we think of Keynes as having triumphed, really has nothing to do with the intellectual coherence of his project. And this is maybe a controversial thing for an intellectual historian to say, but really to do with the force of events. And so it's not as though the general theory comes out in 1936 and that's the end, and the liberal economists have had their day. It really takes the labor movement in the Second World War and then the election of the first post-war Labor government to actually affect some kind of lasting, and even then in all sorts of ways compromised change. So I actually have a lot more to say about what this means about the present moment and why it is that I'm skeptical that without some form of really strong counter movement, we've seen the back of all of these features of the shriveled liberal state or liberal political economy that we at RedMay don't dislike. But I'll maybe end there and then we can talk about it in together.
All right, thanks, Alex. Our second speaker is Catherine Chaput. She is an associate professor at the University of Nevada, Reno, where she teaches courses in rhetorical theory, argumentation, and criticism. She's the author of dozens of articles and book chapters on rhetoric, political economy, and affect. Her most recent book, Market Affect, historicizes economic debates about capitalism and surmises that anti-capitalist theorists need to invent a new human sensibility to accompany their alternative economic imaginations. Catherine.
Hey, thank you. I'm excited to be part of this panel. I had several several speaking engagements in May, all of which were canceled, of course, but this is the only one that was sort of reformed. So, so I really appreciate that. I'm going to also just sort of talk a little bit about my book. The book is called Market Affect and the Rhetoric of Political Economic Debates. Unlike others on this panel, I'm a rhetorician, so that needs a little explanation, I suppose. So rhetoric emerges basically in the 5th century BCE along with philosophy, and it's more or less considered a how-to. It's a practical art, right? So it's about how to negotiate power through discourse. People practice it to retain their resources, to retain their powerful families and the powerful investments, and to convince people to do politically what is expedient for them. So as a consequence, it has a negative valence usually reserved for the sophist, the sophistry, the illusions, the underhandedness, right? But rhetoric, of course, can be used in all kinds of ways. I am not a rhetorician particularly interested in the practice of rhetoric. I am interested in theorizing what we call rhetoric. So traditionally, rhetoricians imagine that there is a sort of a handbook and a hand list of strategies, discursive strategies for convincing people, for persuading people. And of course, those strategies have to do with logic and emotion and ethical persuasions. What is, throughout this long tradition of rhetoric, kind of on the sidelines, is the relationship between rhetoric and the body, and the ways in which bodies are drawn together and work in sort of synchronized ways. So there's a whole range of comments in rhetoric and allusions to bodies being linked together through speech, so that like literally there's something coming, these sort of chains coming out of my mouth and going into others' ears. And then through these chains, I'm able to move people to and fro, get them to do my bidding. So what I'm interested in is the possibility that those metaphorical chains might actually be materially concrete, that there are ways in which bodies are really drawn together in unconscious ways that are neither about exclusively about structures, economic and political structures, nor are they about ideologies or psychologies exclusively, right? So what I want to do in this book, or what I hope to have done in this book, is to offer a slightly different version of rhetoric that is more embodied. And the term I use for that is affect. I'm not entirely sure, after it's all said and done, that that's the right term. Of course, it's a sort of contested term. There's affect in the way that someone like Raymond Williams uses it, kind of structure of feelings, and that informs people like Berlant and others. And that's not quite what I mean. There's folks like Hart and Negri who talk about effective labor. And that's a little more like what I mean, but not quite, because really it seems to me that they're just pulling in reproductive labor into traditional concepts of surplus value. And then there's other people like Brian Masumi, Teresa Brennan, Patricia Clow, who think about affect in a slightly more physiological sense. And that's more where I come down on the notion of affect. So for me, affect is literally a kind of circulating material entity that moves among people and environments, and it connects them and organizes them on a kind of non-conscious way. So it's a circulation of biochemical and physiological material. And in that way, we are persuaded, and we think of these things as sort of natural or instinctual, but there is actually something sort of tugging us along or pushing us back, right? And so I use this notion of affect, this sort of physiological notion of affect, to rethink some of the different arguments, political economic arguments, using a kind of what Said might call a contrapuntal reading, what Kenneth Burke, who's a rhetorician, would call a reading by discordance, but putting kind of unlikely pairings together. So when I say dialogues, I don't mean people who are literally in dialogue, though sometimes they are. What I mean is people who are representative of some of the key arguments in favor of capitalism and key arguments critical of capitalism in various moments. So Alex will probably give me a hard time here, but my sort of first pairing is Adam Smith and Karl Marx. So I don't necessarily make a claim that Adam Smith is the founder of liberalism, but nonetheless, he's a founder of a certain argument that gets reproduced over and over in, with slight differences. So I look at these two arguments, and what you find is that they both have a theory of the human being that is very much a kind of non-conscious entity. So for Smith, it has to do with theories, sentiments, and sympathy. So I read, say, like the theory of moral sentiments as very much foundational to his later, The Wealth of Nations, his later argument about how capitalism is in fact structured. And for Marx, I look at his theory of species being as fundamental to his later work on capital, even though people tend to think about species being as his early ideological work separate from capital. I think it very much informs how he argues in capitalism. And then I look at different moments, crises, touchstones, I don't know if you want to, how you want to name them, these other arguments that get reproduced. And my argument is that there's a sort of implicit theory of affect in Smith and an implicit theory of affect in Marx. And those theories get rewritten in these historical conjunctures. So for instance, in the sort of turn to the 20th century crisis, Keynes is really reworking a theory of affect in many ways. Of course, he's reworking other theories, but one of the things he keeps going back to is the fact that the market made sense for Smith. It doesn't make sense for a global world. So that what sinks exchange is this sort of proximity. And we don't have proximity in the global world. So we need to have these surrogate structures in place. And then I also look at Veblen, who has a theory of instinct with this sort of very interesting sort of evolutionary notion of instinct. And he basically argues that surplus value is this sort of illusory thing, but human beings do have this very real natural instinct toward workmanship, and that we need to use that to mobilize some difference. And then I also look at the kind of post-World War II moment. I'm looking particularly at Hayek and Adorno in that pairing. Hayek, who is extraordinarily interesting, was trained as in psychology, basically, right? He wasn't trained as an economist. He wasn't trained as a political theorist, even though we think of him in those ways. He was trained as a psychologist, and he has this very interesting early book on psychology, The Order of the Mind, which to me informs his later political economic work. And what he basically argues is that there's a whole range of tacit understandings among individuals. And that's really what structures economics, and not anything that we can rationally think of. And on the other hand, what Adorno does is say, like, not only is production alienating, in fact, consumption is alienating. And so he sort of extends some of the problems of capitalism that Marx points out early on, to the whole of society, kind of limiting our ability to produce something else. And I end with a more kind of slightly more contemporary debate between Friedman and Galbraith. And the argument there is that what they've done is they took these arguments, these two different sort of positions on capitalism to the public sphere. And Friedman absolutely trumped Galbraith, not because he had a sort of more sophisticated argument or a more sound theory, but in fact, he had a much more subtle understanding of what I'm calling affect, these sort of relationships among people. And so at the end of the day, what the book argues is that capitalists, unlike their critics, have a kind of implicit, I'm not arguing that this is something that they're consciously doing, but they have a much more implicit understanding of the ways in which human beings are mobilized effectively, what I'm calling affect here, but I'm thinking specifically of kind of non-conscious relations among bodies, than their critics, and they were able to sync those relationships to a political economic structure. So if we want to critique it, my position is that we have tried ideological critique, we've tried raising consciousness, and as folks like Zizek and Jody Dean tell us, the symbolic inefficiency, right? This doesn't work. People are not convinced by arguments, or people might realize these arguments and act contrary to them nonetheless, right? So there's also obviously structural changes we can make in the environment. And I think that we should do both of these things, raise consciousness and change structural relations. However, I think they're both inefficient or insufficient, maybe not inefficient, maybe inefficient too, but certainly insufficient. And what we ought to be thinking about are different practices of cultivating these intra-bodily relationships. And for that, I end up going to Foucault, and I go to Foucault in his last 3 annual lectures, where he talks specifically about practices of ascesis and parrhesia, and the ways in which human beings have to engage in certain kinds of embodied work, as well as intellectual work, to constitute themselves differently. And of course, when anyone's writing a book and they get to the end, they want to wrap it up really quick, which I think I did as well. And now looking back on it, I think, okay, that was a pretty, I agree with my conclusion, but I think it's a pretty white conclusion. I'm really relying pretty heavily on Foucault and not thinking about a whole range of other thinkers that I think could help me out in this regard, the sort of constituting a new human subject, a new human being. So people like Alex Wahalia, people like Sylvia Wynter, people like Mel Chen even maybe, have, I think, a similar understanding of the ways in which human beings can be constituted, but with a little bit more attention to difference. The problem with my conclusion, I think, is that it can be read as sort of universalizing in a way I don't mean for it to be universalizing. So that's my project, really, is to try to convince folks to think about the non-conscious relations between bodies in ways that don't rely on, say, a traditional psychoanalytic tradition, but take up these other kinds of theories, of which there are, a whole range. So I think I'm just going to leave it at that.
All right, thanks, Catherine. The third speaker is Aziz Rana. Aziz is a professor of law at Cornell University and the author of The Two Faces of American Freedom. His current book manuscript explores the modern rise of constitutional veneration in the 20th century and how it has influenced the boundaries of popular politics. Aziz?
So first, I'd just like to say thank you to Phillip and to all the organizers. It's really a pleasure to be here, even if virtually, and also thank you to Michael for moderating our panel and for all of the introductions as well. So I too am working on a book called Rise of the Constitution that's about the role of constitutional veneration in the 20th century. And I'd like to just spend my time kind of thinking about the Constitution's relationship to American liberalism. So there've been many disorienting things about the last few years with the emergence of Trump in the US. And certainly one of the things that's really striking about contemporary American politics is the shift in popular sentiment to the Constitution. So if you grew up in the US, really any time in the last half century plus, really going all the way back to the 1950s and 60s, you would have grown up with a very specific story of the Constitution, namely that it's a document infused with genius, where you should revere the founders, the 18th century founders. And this is something that would have been, hammered home from politicians, on the news, commentators at school. But now increasingly, there's a sense that the constitutional system itself is marked by really profound weaknesses, especially anti-democratic elements that we can get into a little bit more, maybe also in Q&A, that make it very difficult as an order to actively implement popular policies and meaningful transformative change. And this is actually a really significant development, the sort of shift in perspective about the Constitution. And there are many reasons why it's significant, but for our purposes, what I want to focus on is the way in which this has real meaning for American liberalism. Constitutional support, constitutional veneration has been at the heart of the romance of American liberalism in the US. Its ideological justifications, the narrative that American liberals tell about the country and its meaning, the kind of project and sense of purpose, mission that motivates folks like Obama, Bush, Clinton, Biden. And maybe it's actually useful right now to give just a quick definition of what I mean by American liberalism. Really, I'm thinking of a few different related elements. The first is the idea that the US has been free and equal from the founding. And American history is really the unfolding of a kind of an initial project of liberal equality and its steady completion over time, a kind of progressive history that also makes the country exceptional, distinguishes it from European rivals. There's a second element, which is a real commitment to American global power, to empire, and to the idea that American interests are the world's interests. And so the US has a right to project its power abroad. So justifications for the American century. And then let's say the third key element is capitalism. The idea that market capitalism goes hand in hand with the institutions of representative government, as well as with both domestic interests and global interests. And the Constitution has been at the core of each one of these moves. So the defense of exceptionalism, of empire, and of capitalism. Exceptionalism. The thought is that really the American founders, through a kind of science of constitutional construction, of constitutional politics, essentially solved the problems of politics itself. They created a near ideal version of representative democracy that could be replicated both at home and abroad. And in this way, the idea of the US as exceptional is closely bound to the constitutional project. Empire. What is it that the US is supposed to be promoting abroad? It's its vision of constitutional of American power. It's why American interests are the world's interests. And that's precisely because what the US promotes overseas is a vision of constitutional order. Capitalism. It's presumably the connection between constitutionalism, democracy, and market capitalism that serves to justify market capitalism itself, precisely because of the perceived linkage between representative institutions, rights promotion, and market capitalism, that you have strong defense of American-style capitalism. And so to the extent today that the country is sort of dealing with problems of constitutional failure, that really means the country is dealing with a kind of exhaustion in the romance of American liberalism itself. Constitutional failure is the failure of American liberalism. And so that produces a very specific moment that we're kind of working through. And I'd like to spend the rest of my time actually kind of thinking a bit about the historical contingency of the rise of constitution worship in the romance of American liberalism, and then what to make of this present period really after the collapse of the kind of self-justifying narratives of both constitution and nation. Okay, so let's just begin in a sense by going back in time to a century ago. If we were having a conversation about the Constitution really any time between the 1880s and the 1930s, it would look very, very different. Rather than this presumption about the genius of the founders and of the constitutional model, the conversation would instead be marked by profound disillusionment about the structure and the rights provisions organized through the constitutional system. And there were two really profound reasons. Reason number one was the Civil War. It's hard to talk in glowing terms about the Constitution when the Constitution essentially failed as a way of staving off national cataclysm. And for many folks that were associated with, radical Republicans in the late 19th century, with racial reforms, the Constitution is an embodiment of a set of compromises around the issue of slavery that sustained both slavery as an institution and white supremacy. So there's a critique of the Constitution that's tied to the Civil War. But then there's a second profound critique that's a product of industrialization in the late 19th century. So the late 19th century, late 20th century, the so-called Gilded Age, is marked by profound conflicts between labor and business. And that these conflicts end up shaping collective institutions, where the main thing that working people have is the right to vote, a vote that's cabined in lots of different ways. We don't have actually anything like universal suffrage during the period, or frankly, even today. And yet even that power is constrained by the fact that up and down the political and legal order, you have business elites that are able to use veto points to essentially undermine the implementation of popular policies. And the most extreme examples of this are unelected federal judges that can strike down a popular labor legislation. Now, these realities, both the Civil War reality and the reality of industrialization and the ways in which it's heightening class conflicts, and yet in a political context in which the constitutional order facilitates rule by economic elites, leads to the emergence of a new, quote unquote, progressive era conversation about the Constitution that's especially situated in the Socialist Party, but not just in the Socialist Party. And it's built on a systematic critique of the Constitution. And there are three key elements of this critique. And this is a critique that was wide-ranging and in many ways defined a kind of counter-narrative of constitutional meaning. The first critique is about the actual structure of the Constitution. And the argument here is, if you look at the American constitutional order, certainly in the 1890s before the direct election of the Senate, but even following that, there was only one half of one branch of government that's directly elected, the House of Representatives. The rest is indirectly elected, so that's the Senate, the president with the Electoral College, the federal judiciary that's entirely unelected. And that suggests that the entire structure of the constitutional system is really built on principles of counter-majoritarianism meant to constrain mass democratic energy. And that one of the central additional elements of this is it's all then facilitated, this sort of constraint on mass democratic energy, by federalism. The fact that the dominant political unit is the state, and the state has no direct relationship to actual indeed, what has the state primarily done? Argument of Black radical and radical socialists. It primarily operated to sustain white supremacy in the former slaveholding states. Argument number one is about the undemocratic structure. Argument number two is about the symbol of the Constitution. The symbol of the Constitution goes like this. In Europe, feudalism was sustained by symbols of church and crown, like the classic aristocratic symbols. That's not the way that feudalism effectively is sustained in the US. Instead, it's by the symbols of republicanism itself. And there's no greater symbol than the Constitution. And the reason why is that the Constitution is best understood not as an embodiment of the revolution, but as a counter-revolutionary document a decade later that was implemented to curtail and limit popular energy. So this is one of the reasons why originalists, they wanted to go back to the founding meaning. Oh, I'm sorry. So it sounds like I'm freezing up a little bit. So I'll try my best. It just might be the connection. So that, can everybody hear me? Folks that are listening? Yeah. So that socialists basically made an argument that you have to look at the intent of the founders, and that the founders were committed to constructing a constitutional order that constrained popular democracy. And so the symbol of the Constitution as a Republican emblem is actually operating to check and contain democracy. And then there was a third argument. And the third argument was that the heart of American liberalism, now this is even going back to the late 19th century, or 20th century, is built on depoliticization. And in particular, separating process and substance, saying that what we should argue about in politics are a set of contained issues, the substantive policies, but what we should not argue about are the procedural structures within which those issues are debated. And what socialists argued was that you cannot separate process and substance, that the process actually determines not just the agenda, but the possibility of meaningful change as implemented by policy. And moreover, the role of the courts, precisely because the courts were controlled essentially by a business elite, is that even when you actually are able to implement transformative policies, you still have a judiciary that has a final veto point to check it, so that there can be no distinction between process and substance. Both have to be overcome, and they need to be overcome through an insurgent mass movement on behalf of democracy itself, committed to abolishing the Senate, restructuring the courts, but also implementing things like a guaranteed job, an 8-hour day, collective bargaining, a constitutionally protected right to strike. There was no perceived contradiction between socialist constitutionalism and anti-capitalism, so that in order to overcome capitalism, you had to have a commitment both to constitutionalism and to democracy together. Now, what happens in the US is really twofold, and I'll try to cover this more quickly since I only have a few minutes left, is that you have two decisive historical moments, the New Deal and the Cold War. The New Deal is a partial victory of these radical voices, in particular of the labor movement, because it's a moment where the labor movement has the institutional power, both politically, but also in bringing like the productive life of the country to a halt, to be able to actually, through votes, produce the kind of supermajorities that could implement meaningful policy changes, and then, transform the nature of the courts through sustained supermajorities for the Democratic Party. This is what's able to generate a limited welfare state, and then also can push back against some of the conservative efforts to more systematically repeal it. And interestingly, this victory is a kind of defeat for the radical agenda because it seems to legitimate the constitutional order. Things can be changed through the means of the American constitutional system. But really, this legitimation shows the weaknesses. It required massive supermajorities, rolling supermajorities, just to sustain relatively small scale social welfarist changes. And indeed, it highlighted the extent of social dislocation necessary for meaningful change within the existing system. And then there's a second significant moment, which is the Cold War. So what the Cold War does is, by focusing American politics on an external enemy, it moves both left and right to a kind of compromised middle ground that generates greater willingness to conciliate on issues of race, on issues of economy, and also that changes the nature of the courts itself, where the courts become a site for this kind of sustained middle consensus, the so-called New Deal consensus. And at the same time, the example of the Soviet Union and of authoritarian versions of socialism end up delegitimating more radical forms of democratic politics, where American liberalism seems to be the only feasible example of democracy that marries constitutionalism with democratic principles. It becomes the single model. Now, what we have today is a moment really after the collapse of the institutional power of labor, which is a long story, and after the Cold War, where over a series of decades, the basic social conditions that made American liberalism, and here this is really Cold War liberalism, both meaningful and sensical as a mode of thinking about collective life that justified Constitution worship, justified the narrative of romance around the American project. All of those elements have now increasingly collapsed, and you're left with the internal ideological weaknesses. And so that's in a sense where we are. We're at a moment where we're sort of stuck with the kind of contingent circumstances under which constitutionalism in the US could succeed. And so a recognition of its more profound failures and of liberalism's own exhaustion, but a liberalism, especially in the Democratic Party and sort of the centrist wing of the Democratic Party, that might be intellectually exhausted, ideologically exhausted, but has profound institutional power. And so the question really of the present is, in a time when left ideas and the ideas that were so dominant from, let's say, the 1880s all the way to the 1930s are back on the table again, including the notion of an insurgent mass movement committed to cross-racial, class-conscious politics that would produce truly revolutionary reforms that would alter the existing social order. To the extent that those kinds of ideas are now back on the table, what to do about implementing them without necessarily having the same kind of institutional strengths. But there's a real benefit to the present, which is for the first time really since the 1940s, there's the thought that you could actually have a majoritarian politics, a politics of more than half of the people in this country actually committed to meaningful constitutional change, to these types of democratic alterations. In other words, there's no reason to think of radical politics as incompatible with either constitutionalism or majoritarian democracy. And instead, it's becoming increasingly apparent that the appropriate linkages between constitutionalism and democracy, and both in a deep sense in confrontation with capitalism. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Aziz. Our final speaker needs no introduction really, but I'll give him a short one. Phillip Wohlstetter is one of the curators of Red May and a founder of Invisible Seattle. He is the author of Valparaiso, a Requiem in 7 parts, a work in progress. Phillip? Oh, and sorry, Phillip, before you start, if I could just say to those listening, please, as we move through the last presentation, begin to think about questions that you'd like to pose to the speakers, and I'll read some of those after they finish, and we'll have a discussion. Sorry, Phillip, thanks.
Oh, thanks. So I want to start with 2 quotations. The first one by a man named Louis Rougier, which is delivered at the Walter Lippmann Colloquium in Paris in 1937. To be a liberal is not like the Manchesterians to allow cars to drive in all directions at whim, the upshot of which would be an incessant traffic jam and accidents. It's not like the central planners to assign each car its hour for setting out and its itinerary. It is to impose a highway code, while accepting that it is not necessarily the same in the era of fast transport as it is in the age of stagecoaches. Second quote, this one from Chicago economist Gary Becker, inventor of the concept of human capital, a key exemplar of high neoliberalism in Foucault's lecture series on the birth of biopolitics. A crime, says Becker, is any action which makes an individual run the risk of being sentenced to a penalty. Foucault's comment, for Becker, there's no difference between an infraction of the highway code and a premeditated murder. As a rational maximizer, one calculates the risk reward or cost benefit and decides whether or not to break the law. My question, how do we get from quote number 1 to quote number 2? Or in other words, does it make sense to talk about the difference between what we might call the primordial vision of neoliberalism and actually existing neoliberalism. And what I want to say here, parenthetically, is that I want to talk about both liberalism and neoliberalism, because I see them as being equally hostile to democracy, and the notion of liberal democracy is a kind of oxymoron. So I think I agree both with Aziz and Alexander. We'll discover that in discussion. And I think the main difference between neoliberalism and liberalism is its effective economy, which I can link with some things that Kathy says. So onward. I'm going to use two opposed methods to try to answer this question. First, genealogy in the style of Nietzsche and Foucault, and second, a conceptual analysis a la Hegel. But first, let's back up and put the initial quote in context. The Walter Lippmann Colloquium is an informal 4-day conference that came together in Paris to discuss a book by American political journalist Walter Lippmann, a founding editor of The New Republic. The book, The Good Society, drew praise from Hayek and von Mises in Austria, from Ordo liberals William Röpke, Alexander Rustow, and Walter Eucken in Geneva and Freiburg, from a diverse collection of businessmen, philosophers, industrialists in France that included Raymond Aron. They were liberals and they were miserable. Everywhere they looked, they saw a turn to planning, fascism, socialism, communism, Keynesianism. They were looking for something to rally the troops, a way to renew what seemed in the 30s to be a dying ideology. So what did they see in Lippmann's book? The first half reads like a preview of Hayek's Road to Serfdom, gradual collectivism, the theory of democratic collectivism, the intellectual ascendancy of collectivism, the collectivist counter-revolution, the failures of planning. It's not worth the read. But the second half is kind of interesting. Under titles like The Debacle of Liberalism, he critiques latter-day liberalism, which he defines as Manchesterism, his term for market fundamentalism and the ideology of laissez-faire. He holds these epigones entirely responsible for liberalism's crash and burn. He argues for social insurance, infrastructure and educational spending, public lands, government inspection and regulation, and against monopoly rents from land or natural resources. Better, he destroys the intellectual infrastructure upholding laissez-faire. His argument, the notion that there are two fields of social activity, one under the sway of law and one called the economy, subject only to the laws of nature, is a grotesque error. Capitalism developed in the context of law and not in the free realm of nowhere. All freedom, all rights or property are sustained by some kind of law. So the question should never arise whether there should be laws here and no laws there, but only what law shall prevail everywhere. So some quotes here. While the latter-day liberals were gravely concerned what the jurisdiction of the law ought to be, the jurisdiction was at all times universal throughout the economic order. By virtue of that jurisdiction, there was property, there were corporations, there were contracts, rights, duties, and annuities, there was money with which to exchange goods and services, there were standards of weights and measures, and so forth. Or this, the latter-day liberals had a vague notion that they must regard private property as approximating, to use Blackstone's words, that sole and despotic dominion which one man claims and exercises over the external things of the world, in total exclusion of the right of any other individual in the universe. But the rights of property have no existence outside the law. The landowner has no absolute rights in his property. He has only conditional rights which vary from place to place. He cannot put a jerry-built structure up on Broadway, but he can, if he likes, go out into the open country and build himself a house of wooden paper held together by safety pins. The real security of private property must rest not on a fatuous longing for a sole despotic dominion over the necessities of all men's existence, but on the reconciliation of all men's claims in a system of substantially equal rights. It is not loyalty to the cause of private property to confirm the monopolists in their privileges. And the next thing he does, as Aziz talks about in an essay I read in the Progressive Century, is he attacks the Supreme Court for use of what he calls counterfeit natural law, which the judge has made and then found. And this law is used, this counterfeit natural law, to oppose the legislature. Every judicial decision by the Supreme Court since 1870, he says, has been a grotesque caricature, a covert attempt to check popular sovereignty and aid business using the most ludicrous sophistry. Does that sound familiar? Some example, how he talks about corporate personhood. No one reading the 14th Amendment, for example, and remembering that it was designed to protect the personal rights of the newly emancipated Negro will reach the conclusion that the reference to the due process of law meant the corporation was a person and that the states could not fix the terms in which these legal creatures could do business. Or this, a charter of incorporation to use property for profit is a state-created privilege, particularly when it grants its members the partial immunity of limited liability. There is therefore no reason why the charter should be vague and general. It can be made as specific in its definition of what rights the corporation may exercise and what duties it must perform, as the lawmakers choose to make it. In the charter and in the statutes governing corporations, they can stipulate any public policy they deem desirable. They can stipulate that the members of the corporation shall not enjoy limited liability or perpetual succession if the courts find that they have violated the terms of the charter. This is pretty radical stuff at the moment, if it was ever done. So here's the question, the reason I read all this. How do ideas like this resonate with people like Hayek? How can they form a basis for what we know as real neoliberalism? So what Lippmann shares with Hayek is a commitment to social control by law rather than by command, in Lippmann's words. What this entails for Hayek is substituting general constitutional norms for legislation or lawmaking aimed at correcting specific situations, dissolving a monopoly, for instance. This also resonates with the German ordo liberals, whose goal, in the words of Quinn Slobodian, was, quote, to design the right institutions to encase the world economy, period. So we come back to Rouget's image of the highway code, the rules of the road, as both an image of the encasement offered by the rule of law and an embodiment of an agreed agenda for reconstructing liberalism, an agenda for a renewed or neoliberalism. That is, they go away, the things they agree with at the colloquium is to design a system of law that would enable the functioning of a free and fair economy without the need of constant intervention or supervisory control. That this is not natural law, but an act of human construction, and that it's a code of law that would evolve with time and technical change, right? What you have for the era of stagecoaches is not the same as the era for railways. So therefore, it's a liberal rather than a conservative program. So that's the context for the first quote. So now let's try to take it to Gary Becker's quote. How do we get there? I'm going to take the Foucault-Nietzsche road first. So to understand a concept like democracy or the good, it's not enough to excavate its origins. You have to, quote, identify the accidents, the minute deviations, or conversely, the complete reversals, the errors, the false appraisal, and the faulty calculations that gave birth to those things, which continue to exist and have value for us. So everything that comes to us, according to Foucault and Nietzsche, has been hijacked by subjected to successive wills to power. The process of tracing out the complex paths of dispersals is what they mean by genealogy. So two quick genealogical observations on the complex path of neoliberalism. First, a mutation. The idea that liberalism is an artificial construct rather than a mode of the natural never sat well with Hayek's epistemology of the market. His idea that the market is a giant processor of information that makes decisions that can't be made by individual human beings with their limited perspectives, imperfect information, and feeble processing speeds. This sounds, of course, like another version of God or nature, not a human construction. So Hayek thought he found a neat way out of the dilemma without resorting to natural law or constructivism. Borrowing from systems theory and cybernetics, he postulated a third sort of order that was neither natural nor constructed. He called it catalactic or catalaxy. It was kind of an accretion, the product of human action over time, but not of human intention or planning. This sounds uncannily like Lippmann's condemnation of the juridical procedure of late 19th century liberal judges. Quote from Lippmann: apparently they had some sort of notion that because the existing law of property and contracts have not been formally enacted by the legislature, but had evolved by usage and judicial decision under the common law, it was somehow a natural law originating in the nature of things, valid in a superhuman sense. They came to think of these traditional laws of property and contract as prevailing in a realm of freedom, and when statutes that they did not like were enacted to amend the traditional law, they thought of them as interferences by the state. So essentially another sneaky way for Hayek of reintroducing natural law, covertly turning Lippmann's attempted liberalism into conservatism. Another type of genealogical operation is hijacking. Economists of the Chicago School were not present at the 1937 colloquium, but they did turn out in force for the post-war meetings of the Mount Pelerin Society, the next significant gathering of the growing neoliberal flock after the war had interrupted their 1937 organizing efforts. Chicago economics championed some novel positions. Milton Friedman's brother-in-law, Aaron Director, was pro-monopoly, arguing that it was beneficial to consumers, bringing down prices, and that no monopoly could perpetuate its own existence in the face of so many aspirants for its throne. The Chicago people won that battle. They won others that pushed neoliberalism back towards supporting laissez-faire, the object of its earlier critique. I don't want to knock genealogy. It has a lot to tell us about neoliberalism. The titles of two of the newest anthologies, which give us expanded genealogies of neoliberalism as a way of chronicling its metamorphosis and survival, are revealing: The 9 Lives of Neoliberalism and Mutant Neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is a mutant cat with many lives left. The cover story may change, practices may be added or subtracted, but the essential kernel that lingers, the part most difficult to dislodge, is its effective economy, the fiercely embraced injunction to take responsibility for one's life and failure, knowing that's entirely within one's power to change everything tomorrow morning, which is why, as Martin Koning says, every piece of evidence demonstrating that the world doesn't resemble a free market comes to serve as so much more evidence of the depths of corruption. When the market fails to produce more freedom and social order, there must be a conspiracy at work. But I want to focus more on the much more interesting road of Hegelian conceptual analysis. An example of it would be Marx's claim that the idea of the world market is contained within the concept of capital. For Hegel, a concept isn't given by an initial definition, but developed through a series of richer and richer approximations, which paradoxically also include the actualization of the concept. The shapes that the concept assumes in the course of this journey are indispensable for knowledge of it. What often emerges along the way is a contradiction immanent in the concept itself that wasn't apparent initially. I'd like to suggest that the liberal and neoliberal concept of a capitalist market encased in the rule of law contains an immanent contradiction. Wolfgang Streeck has written an interesting article about what he calls the capitalist actor, the rational maximizer, the restless advantage seeker, converting social arrangements into profit-making opportunities. He characterizes this actor as fundamentally unruly. He has a behavioral disposition to put pressure on institutions and twist or circumvent rules. Quote, making a living by specializing in the subversion of social constraints is not just legal, but also legitimate. as is the adoption generally of a detached, probing attitude of instrumental advantage seeking towards social relations. Capitalist social characters may be modeled as lacking any normative expressive attachment to social institutions, enforcing collective solidarity in the sense of restraint on the pursuit of individual interests. They may be stylized as either not socialized at all or socialized in a culture or subculture in which the deliberate outwitting of social rules is an approved and prestige-carrying social behavior. Why do they do this? Because they are bad people? Some of them are, but this is not an answer that Marx would let us get away with. What drives their action is the coercive force of competition. Just one player deviating from the established way of doing things can force all others to follow or risk the ultimate penalty of extinction. Any creative individual can become the leader and create the advantage of the first mover. In principle, everybody must anticipate being attacked and strike preemptively. It may take no more than the possibility of competition for competition to become a reality. Thus, we have a race to the bottom. One defection starts a stampede because, as Streeck puts it, nobody can afford to be left behind in a solidaristic community of losers. He calls this capitalist nervousness. Looming over what we can be no more than a temporary ceasefire is always the possibility of an innovative entrepreneurial competitor finding the benefit of breaking away from the old ways and going it alone to exceed the gains from playing by the rules by so much that it seems worth the risk of losing the wages of peace and attempt to gain the profits from aggression. Branko Milanovic puts it this way: the objective, play the game as close to the rules as possible. And if the rules need to be bent or ignored, try to avoid being caught. And if caught, to try, by using a phalanx of lawyers, to find the most recondite and specious explanations for this behavior. And if that fails, then to settle and sign a non-disclosure agreement. So here we are, back at Gary Becker world, which is also Donald Trump world. Institutionalized social obligations in a capitalist society are permanently in danger of being subverted, if not at once, then slowly and incrementally. The capitalist actor, Trump is a perfect example, is fundamentally unruly. In the words of Streeck, a permanent source of disorder from the perspective of social institutions, relentlessly whacking away at social rules, continually forcing rulers to rewrite them and undoing them again and again by creatively exploiting the gap between the general rules and their local enactment. So rules-based liberalism is tailor-made for this species, provided he has the money to pay and play. While it offers him abundant freedom of action, its rules bind the law-abiding majority, providing almost no democratic mode of redress. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Phil.
Having trespassed on Aziz's realm of law and knowing nothing myself about it.
Well, thank you all for those really, really interesting papers. There's some questions coming in. I encourage folks to send more, and I'll turn to them in a minute. I think I want to start. Well, I'm of two minds, but I guess I am going to start with this now that I've started. In a way, it feels to me like the kind of lazy question, but this is also like the only thing I find myself thinking about most days lately. So I did want to start maybe by, and Alex already did a bit of this, so I might ask a slightly more specific form to him. But I wanted to ask you all to speak a little bit about how you see the pandemic as either sort of sealing the decline of liberalism and neoliberalism in some way, or as Alex suggested in part, as perhaps in some way being an occasion in which it will be reinforced. And so maybe to try really quickly to give a little more specific element to at least some of that. Alex, I was wondering, I haven't followed the Economist as closely, but I was really struck a month or so ago by the fact that the Financial Times started taking a relatively seriously something like social democratic position. Like you just have to throw everything you can at this problem, no matter what. So start just like printing money in effect, and we'll figure it out, you know, with austerity programs somewhere down the road. But like we do whatever we need to do. And so I'm wondering where the Economist has sort of stood on this, if you have a sense. I don't, not assuming you read it every day necessarily, but if you have a sense. And then like a slightly more specific form of that for Catherine as well. I was curious, you know, I was thinking about this issue of affect and the pandemic, because one place this has come up in things I've been reading is where people sort of make a claim that these lockdowns are totalitarian, because we're, you know, Agamben obviously is most famous here, because we're like instilling fear in the people, but you're interested in this kind of way in which affects cultivate connections. And so I wonder if you think there's something like that, you know, that we can build on, that we can turn to in the context of the pandemic to begin to foster that. Yeah, and then I guess, you know, then for Aziz, I'm afraid I don't necessarily have like a super specific form of this. So I wonder if you could just speak to it in general. And I guess then in a slightly more specific form for Philip, and then I'll stop. Like, what do, you know, you said, I think rightly, that often in neoliberal thought that there's this idea that if the market's not working, then there must be some kind of corruption. Do you think this context of the pandemic, where clearly in some sense the market has not worked to distribute PPE or any other number of things we could point to, is that like going to wreck this, or is, as Alex sort of suggested in different contexts, is that going to bring it, or is it going to be able to recuperate and blame this on someone, as in some sense Trump is constantly trying to do? So I'll turn it over to you all.
Should I can
order?
Okay.
Yeah. Do you want to maybe just go in the same order that you presented in? Thanks, Alex. Sorry.
Yeah. So I really appreciated all of the presentations, and I thought that Aziz's ending, in a funny way, I think we ended in the same place, or at least that's where what I was thinking about. What is the situation in which a system is exhausted intellectually? In Aziz, I mean, Aziz is talking about constitutionalism and liberalism, and the ways that those are and aren't related. But what happens when the intellectual hegemony or consistency or ability to command something like active support among the population disintegrates? And yet the institutional power of the liberal state or of these liberal institutions continues, persists. And I think that's what's interesting about our moment. And whether we talk about that in terms of a base superstructure problem, or in terms of hegemony and counter-hegemony, or using various other Marxist or non-Marxist concepts, I think there are grounds to be both optimistic and pessimistic. And Aziz ended on a more rousing note than I did, although, you know, I'd like to think that I have a positive side, you know, as well. I guess in terms of the US example and the reasons for or I guess I'll get to the Economist too in a second. It seems to me that we have, on the one hand, quite a bit of discussion about the inadequacies of this state of affairs, of this system. And that is plain to see in the pages of the Financial Times and the Economist. Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, was in the Economist a week or two ago, talking about the economic future of our grandchildren in so many words, paraphrasing Keynes's vision for a more equitable future, the need for greater spending on healthcare, the need to tackle climate change, basically tearing up the script of an institution that has been deeply embedded in a certain vision of a certain practice of monetary policy in Britain since the Glorious Revolution towards the end of the 17th century. So there is, Martin Wolf in the pages of the Financial Times or Financial Times editorial board saying that we're all comrades, we're all brothers and sisters. Okay, that's there, and it was there after 2008 too. But what has practically changed, and what are the ways in which the liberal state that we have has responded to the crisis? Well, in the U.S. case, it's pretty clear that the instinctual reaction on the part of the ruling class in the halls of Congress has been to do pretty much what they did in 2008, which is to, what is the largest section of, just numerically, what is the largest section of the bailout bill? Well, it's a leveraged lending facility that's propped up asset prices wildly to the point where we live in a world where we'll be approaching 25 to 30% unemployment, but the stock market has pretty much made up all of its losses since the crisis began. So to me, that is a kind of a pretty clear signal that the liberal state functions, but it functions insofar as it performs the tasks to which it has become suited over the last 30 to 40 years. So on the one hand, the bailing out of finance, and on the other, imperial aggression abroad. At the same moment that PPE cannot be found for our service workers, the US has announced new sanctions on Venezuela, on Iran, military exercises in the South China Sea, discussions of new sanctions on China, not just over the role of the Chinese government in responding to the outbreak of the disease in Wuhan, but over Hong Kong. So the imperial state, the financialized state, is capable of responding in the ways in which it has become strong. The Federal Reserve and the Treasury are powerful institutions, even as the Congress itself can't seem to provide a paycheck protection program that keeps people in their jobs. So I think that's a way of trying to answer both of your questions at once, that even liberals, even the greatest defenders, even those at the head of this system recognize that something is wrong, but are powerless or unwilling to act in ways that they to fix those to fix those problems. And one grounds for concern is not only that at the end of this we're going to have such a structurally high unemployment rate, and of course this weakens the power of labor, but also the fact that the two kind of most important political movements against the prevailing order of things that we've had in a mainstream way, the Sanders movement in the US and Corbynism in the UK, have been pushed back by the liberal center. And I'm interested in Aziz's story in part because I think the Cold War has such an important impact on the construction of the liberal tradition. The very fact that we understand it as Lockean, as opposed to kind of a result of industrial capitalism or of the French Revolution, I think is a reflection of Cold War dynamics in which the US plays a central role. But I think that the issue is there too in terms of how we understand the fact that Sanders and Corbyn were defeated, primarily in terms of a kind of conception of Western exceptionalism, of the role of NATO, of, in Corbyn's case, his willingness to question those dogmas, those norms, and in the case of Sanders, it was maybe perhaps somewhat less so, but then that comes into the question that Aziz has raised about the constitutional order in the U.S. and I think of the Cold War and Cold War liberalism in the U.S. as being embodied by Schlesinger and the vital center. But even Schlesinger, by the time Clinton and the Third Way rolled around, in a reference, Clinton makes a reference to Schlesinger in a speech, and after listening to it, and this is the era of welfare reform, says, that's not the vital center, that's the dead center. So anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Alex. Catherine?
Okay. I think that what's really struck me about the pandemic is the ways in which it is just absolutely laid bare the structural inequalities in a sort of biopolitical way, right? So that you have folks, governors, and others who are opening up. When they first opened up, they were very clear, and Trump is clear as well. Yes, people will die. And who are those people? Well, those people are people of color, people in prisons, old people, people in working class jobs, right? So there are particular zones. This is a very biopolitical kind of argument. There are particular zones of human beings that are absolutely dispensable, and other zones of human beings that are, requisite, right? So the fact that our elected politicians can get up in front of people and say this, not only with impunity, but with nobody even batting an eye, really, sort of suggests to me everything that we're talking about with the crisis of liberalism. I mean, the fact that is democracy dead? Surely, you have someone like, what's his name? The zombie economics guy, right? So we have a very traditional, Paul Krugman, right? Very traditional economist who talks about zombie economics. This is his, recent book, and he's touting it all the time in the New York Times. And the basic idea is, oh, you know what? We believe in things that are dead. We believe in markets, and it has been thoroughly slain. We believe in democracy, and it's been thoroughly slain, right? So these systems structurally can keep moving forward, even though it's quite clear to almost everybody all the structural problems of them, right? So in such a situation, it seems to me that what's really important are these kinds of more proximate relationships. So you can have people say, essential workers are so valuable, and it completely rings hollow to the essential worker who, in my local store, there's a sign up and it says, please wear masks. The workers are here for you, but they request that you wear a mask. And of course, we have no way to enforce it. And so you have people literally like picking fights with them over their right not to wear a mask. And I think the only way to really mediate that is on a more interpersonal basis, and not on simply a structural or intellectual basis. And I think that we need to take seriously that person's argument, right? I'm not wearing it. I believe this is a hoax. So, all of these things we could say, absolutely, this is crazy talk. And it is crazy talk. And it is factually inaccurate. And yet there's this human being who's ready to have a fight with me over this, like literally, throw a punch. And something has to be recalculated there. Some kind of human relationship has to be recalculated so that we can't just live in these intellectual silos, because we're clearly not communicating between them, it strikes me. So what will happen post-pandemic? Who knows? But I agree. There's a potential for optimism. There's a potential that it will sort of regrip in a kind of iron way. But with so many people out of work, and I'm not thinking simply of like service workers, I'm thinking of like management and business type folks, and everything being conducted online and through other means, surely people will not be brought back to work in those kinds of jobs. And so there will be a kind of ongoing struggle to figure out, okay, how do we make an economy? Because we can't, I don't think, have a sort of zombie economy, zombie politics with that many people on the fringes. So and then the next 10 years will be interesting. But I'm not in the prediction game, unfortunately. I'll leave it at that.
So I'll take the question to be, what does the pandemic tell us about our sort of the constitutional politics that's been emerging? So maybe the first thing I'd say is, we've just gotten really, maybe used to isn't quite the right word, but we've had a number of once in a century, once in a half century generational shock. So did I freeze up?
You're back now. We lost you for a second.
I'm sorry. I think it might have to do with maybe the connection where I am. So I apologize.
So the last thing we heard was like we were just about to say what the kind of, we've had many generational.
Yeah, in a way, the pandemic is only the most recent of just a number of, massive shocks to the legal political system that the country's faced over the last 20 years, each of which, if you just take them in isolation, seem like the kind of thing that's only supposed to happen once in a century or once in a half century. So the pandemic is supposed to be, this is a once in a century shock to the system. It's, it's biological rather than some of the other ways that people have thought of. But if you just stack it up, we've had a bunch of these. That's one way to think about the Iraq War. The Iraq War is a national security failure of catastrophic proportions, left, over 1 million people dead in Iraq, totally destabilized the Middle East. That is, a failure that you have to go back to Vietnam. So half a century before you find something that's comparable. The financial crisis, that was supposed to be a once in a century kind of shock. You can even think, frankly, about the effects of hyper mass incarceration with African Americans and the ways in which that produced, from 2014 to 2016, years of rolling social rebellion, rebellion and protest in the US, the likes of which the country had not seen in 50 years. And now on the heels of that, not only do you have the election of Donald Trump, who's a total repudiation of the kind of Cold War liberalism that I was describing, highlighting its own kind of intellectual disintegration, but then following that, a pandemic that's, again, a once in a century event. And in this way, I kind of think of the pandemic as just a kind of continuation of the basic failures that the legal political order has had in just addressing foundational crises. That, in a sense, what it does is exposes all of the basic structural weaknesses. And in a way, Trump is an embodiment of that. So the central structural weakness is that we have a constitutional order that dramatically overrepresents a primarily white minority politically within the US, and gives this minority coalition the ability to hold near permanent power without actually building anything like meaningful majority support. And the coalition understands this and is doubling down on the kinds of tools necessary to be able to sustain power even without necessarily winning elections. So through control of the court, through control of the Senate, which dramatically overrepresents Republican and white minority interests. And all of that facilitates the further entrenchment of a deeply destructive and xenophobic politics on the right. And so, what we're seeing with Trump's response to the pandemic and the ways in which he's playing precisely to his own base is an embodiment of the constitutional order that facilitates rule by a minority. And the thing that's noteworthy is that that's something that a lot of folks are just saying. It's no longer a radical position. This is a fairly mainstream position within the Democratic Party. And the difficulty really, and this is, I think, some of the paralysis that progressives have at this moment, and I use progressive here rather than leftist, so sort of the generally like left part of the Democratic coalition, is uncertainty about how to respond to Trump and to the kind of politics that are produced by the constitutional system. And you can see this uncertainty through two kinds of ambiguities. So ambiguity number one is about the Constitution itself. A lot of people right now, within the Democratic Party kind of hold two seemingly contradictory positions at once. Position number one is, it's the Constitution to blame. Like, the Constitution is the thing that's generating these various crises. The Constitution is the crisis. Position number two, the Constitution is the thing that's going to protect us from authoritarianism. So that, you know, Trump's version of presidentialism and like the kind of corruption that you see within the Trump administration requires kind of doubling down on support for the Constitution as a way to confront it. And, you know, those two kind of competing intuitions, I think, produce real uncertainty about how to respond. And you can say the same thing about the Democratic Party, which is one of the ways that I would see what happened with Biden. The party is itself like profoundly corrupt. But on the other hand, there's also the sense that, especially with the breakdown of the labor movement and of real institutions of left power, like the Democratic Party is an institution of power, however compromised it is, that seems to stand in the face of like this like white minority rule. And for that reason, people are really uncertain about how to relate to the party, like to proceed with like a thoroughgoing critique or to kind of accept its compromised form as like something that can be thrown against the politics that's been generated in this moment. And it strikes me that as a result, the left has to have a really clear response to both of those things. It has to have an account of how you can defend constitutional right on the micro level while making arguments for thoroughgoing, like frankly, revolutionary constitutional change. And it also has to have an argument about, you know, the orientation to the Democratic Party, how you can have strategic relationships with the Democratic Party while recognizing that as an institution, it's no longer actually, in any meaningful sense, if it ever was, like an institution of transformative change or meaningful change in opposition. But those are the kinds of things that seem to have been thrown up by the pandemic.
Thanks, Aziz. Philip?
Thank you. Speaking as a member of the generation of '68, the only one, a weakness that still persists on the left is our institutional imagination. The notion that the fact that there's no democratic institution in the United States except the jury system, maybe. The way that's kind of ignored or not brought front and center as a part of any left platform is absolutely amazing. You know, occasionally someone will say, gee, we ought to get rid of the filibuster, you know. And it seems to me that, you know, every couple of years, a constitutional scholar will write something like Sanford Levinson, or a political scientist like Robert Dahl will say, how democratic is the Constitution? Not at all. You know, but then one goes on. There was one goes on with life, and then, you know, moves forward a political movement that doesn't try to deal with that. Occasionally there was a centrist political scientist named James McPherson Burns, I think, or James McGregor Burns, published a book called Packing the Court. And his argument as a strategy was kind of simple. He said, look, what we need is a president who comes in and says, I held the Constitution in my hands. I read it, I look through it, I see no justification in it whatsoever for judicial review. It's not there. So what I propose is we have a process for amending the Constitution. If people around the country feel that they want judicial review, just go in each state and vote to amend it, and I will enforce it after that. But until I hear that, I will accept any law of the legislature as a law, because I don't find the power to overturn it. Now, I'm not saying that that particular strategy is one that anybody has to follow, but the left should be turning out 100 strategies like that to confront each of these institutions and push them to overload and to their deserved destruction because they're anti-democratic. Have them force themselves to reveal themselves as anti-democratic, as the electoral system sort of did when Bernie was running in 2016, and suddenly there was a headline in the sign saying, in the New York Times, it said, in the world's greatest and foremost democracy, people are discovering that the process of electing a president is not very democratic. at any rate, those are wounds that we have to push on as a left. What does the pandemic do? I tend to have a kind of mixed feeling, I think like everybody does, that some, in Alex's book, there's a story about various economist writers, one of whom, Edward Luce, is responding, wrote a book called The Retreat of Western Liberalism and so forth. The Crisis of Liberalism book, of which Walter Lippmann's 37 book, The Good Society, is a classic example, can occasionally be, you know, very incisive at diagnosing what the crisis is. It's only in the last few chapters that it retreats back to traditional bromides. But what's fascinating about this guy Luce is if you compare him when he's talking about what liberalism, problems with liberalism, to what Obama is saying, Obama is just, you know, I don't know if you saw the interview the other day when he talks about how really there's not much of a difference between Americans. We all believe in this or that, you know. No, I mean, for Luce, you know, the scale of inequality, the unresponsiveness of institutions, the total loss of faith in parties, the utter financialization of things is an extreme emergency. He at least sort of announces what's going on. But there's a tendency of the people who are supposed to report in our country on the liberal side to poo-poo it or pay it down, you know. I think the one thing about the crisis, the pandemic, it's revelation that we live in I don't want to use the word third world state, which is obviously a colonial form of describing it, but that we are not the masterfully in control power that we pretend to be, the world's foremost democracy, the leader of the world in this, that literally on any scale of health or taking care of our population, we're very low and we're going down, and that the utter failure of all authorities to respond is going to make an impression, you know. But I think we get back to Kathy's discussion about the effective dimension. The one difference between liberalism and neoliberalism, I think, is what Jason Reed calls the effective economy. What do you want to be told? Do you want to be told that, look, I mean, if you look at it structurally, your ability to succeed or to create your own life is almost nil. You're headed downward. That's the reality, right? Or do you want to be told you're an entrepreneur of yourself? You know, everything that you've done that fucked up, that didn't pay attention, you know, that's in the past. Tomorrow is the first day of the rest of your life. You get your head together, you walk out the door, you too will have a startup of your own, a CEO, the American dream. It's still alive. You know, the neoliberalism effective dimension is so strong that everyone who tells them that the market doesn't work like that is part of the corruption, the conspiracy, the swamp, you know? And that's the problem. We don't understand what the effective story that the left is telling, or should be telling, that has the same effective hold, that this thing that I'm in control of my life, even though everything about it is fucked up, you know? And I don't know how to get beyond it. That's the thing that we're competing with, that goes with the absolute horror of what the pandemic is revealing to everybody about, gee, you know, I don't want to go in a rest home, maybe a nursing home. I don't want to go there. I'll die there, you know, and maybe privatization is not such a great idea. But I mean, that's it. You know, in other words, it's a zombie. Its ruling ideas have died, but the effective dimension of neoliberalism is still around and can keep it going and keep those 9 lives of the cat going. So that's my thought.
Thanks, Philip. So I'm gonna follow up with one of the questions that came in, but I also want to encourage you all to pose questions to each other in the time we have remaining. We're all sort of here to hear you all interact. So if you have questions or thoughts in relation to what each other have said, would be great to take that up too. Some of you have done that already. So the question that came in is, it was specifically for Aziz, but I think it's possible that other folks may have thoughts on it as well. And so someone asked whether what the cause is, how we might think about the causes or the reasons for there being this kind of recurring set of once in a century crises. Is that somehow linked to the kind of general crisis of liberalism in some way that some of you at least are pointing to? Are there other factors going on? How are we to think about what are these series of crises, and might we be facing more, and what posture towards them ought we to be taking? I don't know, Aziz, do you want to start maybe? And
yeah.
Anyone else who wants to jump in?
So my own view about it is that that the ideology of American kind of Cold War liberalism itself actually generated the set of problems that it then was sort of tasked with attempting to solve, in the sense that, so you have imperial overreach that's justified because of a fantasy around the legitimacy of American power, justifications for US international authority. And then that overreach ends up producing all of these problems that are tied to American empire. And then the solution, of course, ends up being to kind of double down on the ideology through various forms of intervention. And you can tell that same story across all of the different kind of key elements of American liberalism. So you can say the same thing with American style capitalism, where the kind of the solution to profound internal problems within the basic kind of provision of goods is then to imagine that the market is the solution, and then the market itself fails at addressing these issues, and you're left with various crises. Or, in a way, like the pandemics, to me, the way that it kind of connects to this is the centrality of efficiency, and therefore of effectively risk maximization for most people in how the economy is itself organized. And so if everything is built about efficiency that's supposed to minimize risk for those that own capital and maximize risk for the rest of us, then essentially what ends up happening is that when you have crises, you're left with these moments of profound stress and breakdown. So it's not a coincidence that we've seen over the last 2 decades shock after shock after shock. They're a product of the internal logic of the existing liberal state and the liberal order. But I'd add one thing, that it's different than the kind of vital center that Alex was talking about, because one of the things that 40s and 50s moment did, and I don't want to glorify it or romanticize it at all. Most of my work has basically been a critique of the American Cold War project, but it still generated a kind of baseline commitment to racial ameliorism, limited social welfare state. And essentially the version that we've seen post the 1980s is a brand of American liberalism more or less on steroids, removed of all of the kinds of constraints that actually allowed folks to buy into it in a more wholesale way in the mid-20th century. And so now we're left with an extreme version of the liberal logic that is especially ill-equipped to address the problems. And so, the thing that's sort of interesting about the moment is I actually think that the return of the left more generally means that the problem is not a problem. The problem, there's certainly a problem of political imagination, but there's also a lot of kind of exciting radical thinking that's taking place across our kind of intellectual landscape. The issue is how to kind of transform that thinking into something that has organized institutional power. That's the difficulty of the present.
Thanks, Aziz. Does anyone else want to jump in?
Alex, you looked like you were going to jump in.
Yeah. Oh wait, no, sorry. Yeah, I was just going to add. I think that makes what Aziz said makes a lot of sense to me. I was just going to add that another reason that I think these crises are becoming, these once in a generation crises are becoming more and more frequent. It has to do with the transformations in global capitalism, and the fact that in that financialization neoliberalization of our economies is in part a response, in my view, at least, to a crisis, to a kind of classic Marxist explanation of a crisis of overproduction, in the sense that, you know, starting around the late 60s, early 70s, you get later developers, Japan, West Germany, and so forth, coming online, leads to crisis in profitability. Financialization is a strategy, and whether you take a Harveyan view of that or you take a Brennerite view of it, there's an account of financialization and of the reasons that capital turns to those strategies that helps explain why, starting in the 80s already, the savings and loan crises, the fact that you have the, you know, rapid East Asia crisis, the Russian long-term capital management, hedge fund crisis. These, in other words, I agree with Aziz that this is a continuum. It's just I just wanted to add that this to me is a continuum based on the kind of the bargain that is made in terms of this process of inflating asset prices. What I think Brenner calls asset price Keynesianism, the privatization of Keynesianism as a kind of stock market boom and bubble, or rather a boom in a stock market bubble. And so, you know, the thing about the pandemic that's interesting in a way is that it you know, in terms of Phil's point too about the, you know, the problems of the market, you know, pointing it out as being kind of, this is corruption, you know, anything that can't be explained on those terms imminently, is that the pandemic seems to be an external shock, right? There's an account of the crisis that is possible, and I don't agree with it. I think Mike Davis has provided a powerful antidote to thinking about the crisis as a kind of external shock from nature, from beyond. But I think that I can see a kind of a counter response, a neoliberal counter response or a liberal counter response, being that, you know, really things were proceeding nicely before this took place. And I mean, of course, I think that's ludicrous, but there is a sort of version of that I've been reading in the Financial Times and the Economist, which is something like, well, look, wage growth had started to pick up and unemployment was at an historic low, you know, and then this crisis came along, and now we really face a problem. But I think I'm just sort of suggesting very briefly that it's important to think about the crisis and the response to it as being part of a series of kind of increasingly fragile, increasingly frequent financial crises that have rocked the global economy, that has really not been performing historically very well, certainly since 2008, but for 30 years before that.
Yeah, that's interesting. You could perhaps argue that too, tying in with what Aziz says, is ultimately a function or an effect of a Cold War liberal project, because it's the U.S. that went out to prop up the European, to rebuild the European and the Japanese economies, and to not care about balance of trade, to which it ultimately has to turn to financialization. But do other folks have thoughts or responses?
I was going to say that the peculiar thing, which is hard to read as to where it's going, is the discovery that the Republicans in America came up with of succeeding by failure. I mean, that starts off the simple thing of eroding state capacity by cutting funding to agencies and stuff that then makes the agencies' service much worse, which then gets people anger at the government to push for more government, to push for more cuts, to turn it over to the market. So there's this spiral, starve the beast spiral that just keeps pushing downward. And there's a kind of equivalent of that in Trump's approach to the pandemic, where there was a certain point where his whole attempt to even deal with it and control it just stopped. And instead, he just started throwing out conspiracy theories, let it go, liberate Michigan and so forth. And he's betting that doing nothing to do it, that showing absolute incompetence can in some way win at the end, because it reinforces the prejudice, the ways people have started to think about the government in terms of being run by a conspiracy, or the media by conspiracy and so forth, rather than actually trying to do anything that could possibly alleviate that. I mean, of course, all the New Yorker readers and things think, oh, well, that can't possibly work. but I don't know.
Can I actually jump in here on this point for just a quick thing, which is I do think it's interesting the difference between how the Tories have responded in England and how the Republican Party has responded in the US. And, here's one place where, the electoral system and the relationship between the electoral system and the constitutional order makes a difference. Because if you don't actually have to build a majority coalition, it fundamentally alters your incentives in terms of the kind of policies you implement. It makes it possible to have a kind of starve the beast approach that's built around, dividing up the states and preserving to the extent that you can whatever your voting coalition is, in a way that, for example, in a sense, like Boris Johnson was confronted by, you can't just have an approach that's about, building herd immunity if you still have to operate within a more, ultimately not truly little d-democratic, but significantly more little d-democratic electoral map than the US.
I'll just say, going back to the financialization issue, surely there seems to be, particularly since, say, the triumph of capitalism, kind of notion of limitless possibilities, and this goes hand in hand with greater financialization and more sophisticated financial tools. And of course, the 2008 bubble is absolutely tied to financialization, but I don't think we can separate that from production. So for all of the financial mortgage tools, there were homes that were being built and land that was being sort of redesigned and re-inhabited. And I just raised that in terms of this notion of subsequent major crises, and the pandemic in particular, because we haven't really talked about the environment, and the environment seems really crucial to all of this, and the ways in which we will likely continue to have pandemics and novel viruses because of the ways in which we are sort of inhibiting certain environments where some organisms thrive and forcing them into other spaces that are foreign to them. And so I just think we need to think about financialization and production simultaneously, and also capitalism and environmentalism kind of simultaneously as well.
Thanks, Catherine. Philip, I know you want to make a closing comment at the end. Do we have time for another question, or should we go to that now?
Let's take another question. I mean, it's so nice to get everybody here and have a chance to talk. There's not a lot of stuff to do except watch television. So why not pursue an amiable conversation about the world?
I'll just go then for the kind of summative question that came in that many of you have already spoken to in a way, but maybe if you all have something brief to say about it, we can close with that. And the question was about the title, or kind of coming off of the title of this panel, what was liberalism? And in a sense asking whether that title isn't over optimistic, right? So is liberalism ultimately on its way out, or are we going to see something like forms of as in the book Philip referred to earlier, mutant liberalism or mutant neoliberalism? And I guess I'll add to that, maybe when you talk about that, and again, some of you have spoken to this, but what if we want liberalism ultimately to be in the past tense, then what are the kind of most important things we should be thinking of strategically or organizationally right now? And brief answers to that, of course. Maybe we can just go in reverse order from the way you all presented. So starting with Philip this time.
Whenever I think about liberalism, particularly the centrists in the Democratic Party or Hillary Clinton, I keep thinking, who are their constituency? How big is it? They're on an island somewhere, and literally nobody who looks at, maybe a few people, but, I can see what the other constituencies are, but I just think, all right, this is a group that has its paws on the levers of institutional power. And if you put the media together, and I think when you watched the 20 debates, you just have to realize that the people asking questions share all the assumptions of those as to what political good sense is from the liberals and so forth, and for me watching them and others, I think, get out of the way. We're in a kind of a slow motion civil war, and we can't really engage with the enemy when you're sitting there and you're just clogging up the lanes between us, and yet, so they do clog, they do stay there. I mean, and they may be clogging up the lanes for a while. I don't think their ideas have any credibility whatsoever anymore. I mean, except within their circles and their publications, they keep droning, Obama keeps, giving us the various sermons about acquiring the skills to compete and so forth. But, I mean, who listens to that younger than 45? I don't think it has, when I grew up in the 60s generation, you still had Cold War liberalism, which was obviously an enemy from the New Left and so forth. But you also had liberals who were down on the front lines in the Vietnam War, who were writing for the New York Review of Books, who were pretty radical, and came down to join the vets during the 1971 march against the war in Washington. Liberal senators and congressmen came out and sat with them when they were trying to throw them off to evict them. So, at that time, there was still something that was alive in it, but I can't see anything that's alive in it. I just see them occupying space. That doesn't mean that I think in any way they're going to go away, or that particular effective dimension of the American dream, which is after all a sort of a liberal thing, is going to disappear. And I don't really know at what point, things like South Carolina won't happen, and that suddenly in 3 days, everybody's looking forward to this great season of mobilizing and campaigning, and it's over even before the coronavirus is gone. What happened there? Where did that come from? Why didn't we anticipate it? What should we have put together in terms of a coalition that could have resisted that? I don't know, but I don't think intellectually, I think liberalism doesn't have any ideas that have any purchase.
Yeah, I mean, so I think I largely agree with what Philip just said, and I suppose what I would add is that this moment strikes me as one where the country's just ideologically fractured in a way that we really haven't seen in decades. Maybe since the 60s, maybe frankly since the 30s and 40s, and I think the kind of liberal center is still absolutely present as a powerful political force, perhaps still the political force in the country, depending on how the elections are going to go in 2020 and 2022, 2024. But for the first time in a long time, you have both a self-assertive, self-conscious radical left, willing to folks willing to call themselves socialists, and you have the return of a really virulent form of white nationalism. And so that's the thing that kind of makes this moment really distinctive. I think the power that liberalism has now is not about the power of the ideas. So maybe this is a difference between, today as opposed to when Schlesinger was writing The Vital Center. There was a sense in which Cold War liberalism was articulating an agenda that had real intellectual strength. So that's not there. But what's there is, I think affect is a really important point here. What's there is nostalgia. And so the romance of American liberalism, I think, has largely waned because of a sense of the kind of profound failures of the policies of the last 2 decades. But there's still a huge amount of nostalgia in the American public for a past in which the US could really think of itself as exceptional, as dominant, as the country of the future. And that's something that is really hard for folks to let go of. I think we saw that in the Democratic Party in the primary, and I think we're going to see that going forward. So that's the thing to me that the liberal center has. I'd also say something else, which is I've spent basically all of my conscious political life railing against liberalism. And one of the things that the last few years has sort of highlighted is the way in which the kind of Cold War consensus not only suppressed the left and, you know, really marginalized left-wing politics and engaged in all sorts of violence against left-wing activists and thinkers, but also in a real way did suppress the white supremacist right, and especially that combination of economic populism and white nationalism that's probably been the most potent mode of political ideology in the US going all the way back to the founding. And to say that, you know, what was liberalism isn't necessarily too hopeful, because it's also to highlight the way in which ideological fracture means today having to confront through real political struggle, the forces of an unreconstructed right. And that's, I think, the future. The future is one of sustained battle, but it'll be battle at an institutional disadvantage because the center continues to hold the levers of power with, you know, Democratic Party elsewhere. The right's, you know, brand of increasingly like xenophobic and extreme politics, you know, goes hand in hand with business interests, just as fascism did. And so, you know, there's lots of institutional power for the left, including like the levers of the state right now. And what like the left has is organizing, is grassroots energy, like intellectual seriousness, ideological commitment, you know, but it doesn't necessarily have the tools that the other side has. And so that's going to be the future. And it's clearly, you know, none of it is foreordained or determined, but that also doesn't mean that it's necessarily a story of defeat.
Catherine?
So, yes, I agree with all of that. I definitely think liberalism is dead. I think, frankly, a certain brand of democracy is run its course. But I also think that, you know, afterlives can be very powerful. That, you know, zombies and hauntings and other spirits, if you will, can secure and maintain and mobilize power in really important ways. And so consequently, it seems to me that we have to sort of engage in both a sort of fast politics and a more slow politics. So if we think about what Phillip was saying with the Lippmann conference, I mean, that was over 100 years ago. Neoliberalism as a kind of resurrection of a certain kind of you know, economic power, I guess is what I'll say, took decades. It took decades, 50, 60 years before it really got traction. And then it would get economic traction, and then political traction, and then cultural traction. So there is that kind of long game that I think we need to play. And in part, I think it's important that we play that game by doing more sort of social movement, participatory kinds of actions, where I think that kind of spontaneous rethinking and imagination can really take place. And then I think we do need to do these more kind of fast politics where we're having to respond and vote for Biden. You know, I think it's important to vote for Biden right now. Did I want to vote for Biden? Hell no. And yet here I find myself feeling I must, you know, but 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, really, I used to, you know, have on my door, my office door, don't vote, it only encourages them. And now I find myself feeling I must vote because there is so much at stake, I think, in another 4 years of Trump, for instance. So I guess that would be my response.
Thanks. Alex?
Yeah, so yeah, I think I'll just respond to a part of that question about sort of wither the left as regards liberalism, the relationship between the two. I think that it's important to draw some lessons from. I mean, this is a truism. It's important to draw some lessons from what happened in the Sanders campaign. As Phil was describing it, there was a moment where the Democratic Party seemed to be the Titanic, and the Sanders was the iceberg, and it was all going so well. And then in a few days, that entire narrative unraveled, and Super Tuesday more or less finished off the campaign. I think one of the things that's interesting, perhaps a cause for optimism, is this notion of winning the argument. I mean, it's obviously has long been meant as a consolation in the liberal press. The Times editorial page has been telling Sanders supporters since before the campaign began that they had won the argument and there was no need for Sanders to present himself as a possible candidate, and shouldn't he make way for someone younger or someone a minority or a woman, and so forth. And so I'm suspicious of this idea that the left should be content with winning the argument. But I think that it's important to kind of to figure out what that means. In places like Texas and Maine and in other states that Sanders lost, the majority of exit poll surveys showed that people favored Medicare for all and the college debt forgiveness, signature parts of his platform. Now, I think, having said that it actually would be a mistake for the kind of growing but still small young socialist, diverse socialist left to take any comfort from that, because if all that winning the argument means is that that people vote for the Democratic Party as represented by Biden, only to find, as will inevitably be the case, that Biden and the Democratic Party as it exists is not only incapable of putting into action those plans, but unwilling to, resistant to it. I think that there sets in a kind of disillusion, a sort of an inevitable disillusionment, and that is not the sort of path forward for socialists who need to think in the longer term about how to construct their own independent organizations that are connected to the struggles of renters or the struggles of workers and struggles of their communities and so on and so forth outside of the Democratic Party. That doesn't mean that people shouldn't vote or participate in electoral politics. I don't believe in some kind of like crude critique of electoralism, qua electoralism, but I do think that we need to be very wary about reinforcing a party that is, let's be very clear about the response of the Democratic Party to the present crisis. It was Pelosi, who's worth over $150 million, the leader of the caucus in the House, who withdrew sensible proposals on the part of Republicans to provide everyone with the same level of monetary compensation, who watered down the student debt relief components of the bill, who refused to include a paycheck protection plan that would actually deal with the crisis as was. So there is an ideological force within the Democratic Party that is alive and well and deeply, deeply resistant to changing. And I just say one more thing that I think relates to what Aziz and Kathy were saying, which is that Aziz was saying that the kind of Cold War version of liberalism persists as a form of nostalgia that is very powerful. And I think that is true, and Biden is evidence of that. And I think though we need to think though about the response of the Democratic Party to Trump's election. From my point of view, it was always a mistake to kind of insist on Trumpism as a kind of homegrown form of fascism, either incipient or activated, because it led directly to the road to elect. It led directly to the ideology of electability, and it led directly to Biden, who embodies every kind of element, of the kind of Cold War consensus around American exceptionalism, who at the end of the Cold War, not to speak of what he was doing during it, voted to expand NATO to the border of Russia, voted for the war in Kosovo, wanted the US to intervene in Darfur was dissatisfied with Clinton's efforts in terms of humanitarian intervention, and who of course played an instrumental role as the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee in not only making the case for the war in Iraq, but in providing a kind of kangaroo committee that heard exclusively from those who thought that it was important to take out Saddam Hussein. So I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, but it is interesting and consistent with some of what we've all been talking about, that this particular near octogenarian is the one that we've ended up with, who embodies so much that is seemingly stale and dissatisfying about the particular vision of American exceptionalism, and that is who we're being asked to vote for in the hopes of some kind of progress. I think we should be skeptical of that.
Well, thank you all so much for a really interesting, excellent discussion. Philip, do you want to end things out?
Thanks, Michael, for doing a great job moderating, and thank you, Kathy, Aziz, and Alex for great contributions. You know, in a way, as I advertise future events, we're going to be continuing some version of this particular conversation over the next week. Some of the events may have different titles and names, but they basically keep coming back to the pandemics and politics and what's about it like. So, you know, Jody Dean, communism or neo-feudalism is kind of based on the notion that in terms of tendencies, there's a tendency when, if one imagines that this liberal center cannot hold, our alternatives are going to be, like Aziz said before, I think, you know, that we never had to deal with confronting this national right, who were kept in check by this Cold War centrist liberalism, but which now is weakening. So these people are starting to appear. You know, we also have on Tuesday, Thinking the Pandemic, State and Revolution, which Michael is going to be one of the discussants on, talking about his virus piece, Inspector, and so forth. So, you know, things will continue there. So lots of good stuff to hear. Tomorrow, I'll just finish with that. We have bottlenecks, choke points, and supply chains at noon. Political economy of COVID-19 at 6. Socialism after Sanders and shelter in place at 1 on Sunday. Belabored in Seattle at 6. And you know, on Tuesday, the same day that we're having Michael talk about his thing at 6 p.m., we have a panel that finally got a name today called Predation Confronts Decline, with Robert Brenner and Aaron Benioff. So that should be great. So please come, subscribe to Red May TV on YouTube. And if you're feeling generous, go to our website, redmayseattle.org, and click on donate, or do it on the Red May YouTube channel. There's a little link at the bottom. Good night, everybody. I can't think of any jokes to make, so I will leave everybody in their current thoughtful stance after listening to such wonderfully articulated and cogent responses to the current moment.
Thanks so much.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.